Would you please join me in welcoming Professor Huib Schippers?
Thank you very much. I was not going to be emotional about this at all, so I won't, but it is actually really, really meaningful to see so many people that have played such an important part in my life over the past 12 or 13 years since I've been here. I won't mention them all, although I might mention them as we move along, but the support I've had from colleagues, from students, from everybody around here has been absolutely amazing. Maybe I should mention Paul. Having a Pro-Vice Chancellor who actually understands our vision of what we want to do with this place and what we wanted to do with the research centre has been incredibly meaningful, but so many drinks, serious discussions, unserious discussions, long, complicated processes, horrible deadlines to meet, Danielle, and Kathy for that matter. The stress just before handing in doctoral theses, don't know if you remember any of that. There's so many things that I've shared with so many of you, and I'd like to thank you all. It has been an incredible communion of souls and of thinking over many, many years. And while I'm really looking forward to start at Smithsonian because of its incredible concentration of cultural and intellectual power, there's many things I'll miss about this place as well, including my beautiful bicycle ride from Kangaroo Point to South Bank, which is probably the best city bicycle ride you can have anywhere in the world to work. I've modestly named my presentation Sound Futures, Assorted Reflections, possibly falling just short of a grand unified theory of everything musical. I thought it might appeal to our guest, Roy Howard, as well. He's someone who's of grand ideas. What I will do is string together some of the ideas and experiences that have grown over these past 12 years into something that I suspect and sincerely hope has some coherence by the time I get to the end. You see my typical modesty. Let me start with, actually the very first time I was here in 2002, I think it was, 2001 or 2002, Simon de Haan, the fifth patriarch of this august institution, invited me to come and speak at a conference called Connecting With in this very hall. And one of the reasons I got this job is because I played this little video.
And about this time I said to Osa, let's give the boys and girls some modern jazz. Savages are greatly puzzled by a phonograph, but the childlike pygmies accept it without curiosity as just another wonder of the white man. It was remarkable the way they quickly caught the rhythm of our modern music. Sometimes they got out of time, but they quickly came back to it again.
This is kind of a prelude to what I want to be saying. And I showed you this because it illustrates my incredible joy that you get from doing research. The richness of signals in this are kind of a anthropology or thick description in Keats's term 101. As you could see, it's rich in subtle hints regarding underlying constructs, the values and attitudes that the Johnsons, who were a couple who in 1932 made the movie called Congorilla, which was the first movie with sound coming from Africa. It was quite a significant event. And I just found out there's a book about it as well, which I never knew before. I just saw that online. So it's rich in subtle hints regarding the constructs. Subtle signifiers are the words, most savages, the childlike pygmies, just another wonder of the white man, shows something about how they position themselves in order to their subjects. If you look at the choice of music, let's give the boys and girls some modern jazz, and later, without any irony at all, our modern music, which is quite interesting. If you bring jazz to Africa and you call it our modern music, I thought that was very telling. And then there's the symbolism. Of course, the full tropical gear versus the nudity of the savages, but even more prominently, the textbook phonograph on top of a traditional drum. You can't have a clear idea of how colonialism works. I'm not even talking about embodiment and movements and gestures, which are important. So in 1 minute and 43 seconds, we have a fantastic idea of how in 1932 we looked at music from across the world. It's very easy to be all self-satisfied and say, these dumb people in other places, these dumb Americans, but I'm going to be one of the defenders of Americans from now on. So I think it's good. I think it's good that we juxtapose this with something that was published in 1932 in a newspaper, I think in Adelaide, about the Aboriginal of Australia being much more intelligent than supposed as the psychology of primitive people by, as the Porterus says. So there's a lot of thinking that we have changed in the last 80 or 90 years, and still much changing to be done. That was my prelude. I'm going to talk about music in 3 different parts. One is music and individuals, the second is music and communities, and the third one is music from a global perspective. One thing I found doing some research for this lecture is how incredibly primitive and incorrect dictionary definitions of music are. When we work with doctoral students, we ask them to define all kinds of things. Define how you talk about community, what is classical music, what is this music, what's that music. We never dare to ask them, define what music is. Because in about 4,000 years, we actually haven't worked out what music is. And while there's more refined thinking in other disciplines, these are some seriously bad definitions of what music is from leading dictionaries. Vocal or instrumental sounds, or both, combined in such a way as to produce beauty of form, harmony, and expression of emotions. That's a very good expression of, a very good way of describing 19th century Western music, which Stephen and I, we both love and admire. It doesn't work for many other musics. The Cambridge Dictionary tries a pattern of sounds made by musical instruments, voices, or computers. So somebody's been fiddling with that computer, with that definition in the last 30 years. Or a combination of these intended to give pleasure to people listening to it. And she does much music which is not intended to give pleasure to music. There's torture by music as well. Finally, my American colleagues at Merriam-Webster talk about the science or art of ordering tones or sounds in succession, in combination, and in temporal relationships, which actually is pretty okay, to produce a composition having unity and continuity. And we know that many pieces of music don't have that, and Stephen and I have had many discussions about such matters. So it's interesting that we try to avoid what music is, and I don't think it's resolvable, the problem. I think it makes much more sense to talk about how music relates to people. So while musicology, music philosophy, and music education have contributed more refined definitions and approaches to this discussion, it's probably ethnomusicology, with its focus on music and culture over the past 50 years, The anthropology of music of Merriam in 1964 has been an incredibly important work in that. It's probably that approach that best informs the search for a valid approach to humanly organized sound, which is one of the definitions that ethnomusicology tried, which Blacking cheekily turned into soundly organized humanity, which I think is very funny and makes it very unworkable as well. Humanly organized sound is probably not covers everything that music does, but we actually have much humanly organized sound that would be very difficult to define as music, such as me speaking at this moment, which is humanly organized sound, or semi-organized sound at least. Similarly, while I've never been particularly convinced about zoomusicology, the science of the music of animals, at a conference in Ljubljana, one of my fellow keynote speakers from Italy convinced me that humpback whales have a particular song repertoire which they pass on to their children. The children learn it and they vary on it. And there's different style schools of humpback whale singing. So the humpback whale experts will hear, oh yes, these are Eastern Pacific whales or Northern Atlantic whales. So if there is a tradition which is handed down, which is changed by the next generation receiving it and forming a style school, it's actually really difficult to distinguish it from particular other forms of sound. So I think calling any birdsong music is a bit difficult to do, but by the time you get something which has a tradition, it's really quite difficult to argue against it. So definitions of what music is may always remain at sea between being too specific, like the dictionary definitions we've seen, and too general, like humanly organized sound. But it's probably more interesting to explore what music does, what it actually means to people. And this is where the anthropology of music, if you like, comes into being. We can speak much more sensibly about how people use music than about what music is and what different musics are. We see people play or sing with or to their families, to their loved ones, to their ancestors, to their friends, with people that share their love for sports, politics, and dance. And I'm sure that all of these evoke sounds in you. I've carefully avoided any kind of copyrighted music here because the strange thing of working in music that when we do lectures where we play Rolling Stone songs or Bach, so, we get into problems with copyright as soon as we put it on the internet. The 1932 recording is just outside of copyright. People play or sing to potential mates. A lot of music is made for that. Interestingly, love music is usually made for people that you want to have something with or after you're done with them and are angry with them. There's actually very little music saying, isn't it great, we've been sitting on the couch watching television for the past 20 years. The only song that I can think of is the Beatles' When I'm 64. That's the only one that probably expresses that emotion, but it's almost always about wanting something or being frustrated or trying to process the emotions that come after a relationship. And I think that's quite telling about a lot of music has to do with something aspirational. We sing to colleagues, to people that live nearby, to people we want to reach across valleys or across oceans, to people that we respect and the people that we want to honor. But we also use music to intimidate those we want to change. The music of the janitars, the Turkish janitars, was actually to scare the enemy. So they came with their drums, and from 10 miles away, you could probably already hear the drums. And by the time half a day later they were there, the people in the little village were so afraid that they were probably ready to surrender already. We use music to deride people that we despise. We use music to scare enemies and to scare prisoners. And some use of music for torture is very, very highly dubious. There's more ways. We use music for communicating both clear messages and sentiments, for instance, in commercials. and those that may be difficult to express in other ways. One of my favorites is Oh Lord, Won't You Buy Me a Mercedes-Benz by Janis Joplin, which is a beautiful echo of Bach's Ich ruf zu dir, Herr Jesu Christ. I call out to you, Lord Jesus Christ. We use music to communicate with the people that we can't reach without music. Or at least it's more difficult to reach them, or less enjoyable to reach them these other ways. And while there is some music that can be seen to have no human addressee at all, the Singing for Country that we have with indigenous people, though usually that's a community event, singing to the gods can be a solo thing, or singing to just a single person, singing to oneself for comfort, or for courage, or singing to beloved. Most music is actually firmly rooted in and directed at community. If we look at music as a whole, or actually musicking, which Small describes as the entire process around music, including listening and dancing to music and composing music, it seems that musicking functions as an instrument to position people in relation to themselves, to their communities, and their wider environment. And in that sense, music helps people metaphorically find their place on the planet, in the universe, if you like, much like a global positioning system, a GPS does, like the ones we have on our phones and our cars. Music obviously contributes to a sense of identity, of belonging, of community, of history, of connectedness, and of well-being, which is probably a key reason why you find music in virtually all cultures, eras, settings, and places. While music is not essential to human survival, you will never find in a newspaper that somebody has died from music deprivation. So they found a lady in her apartment and the coroner says she died of music deprivation. We see music in virtually all cultures in the world. So of all the non-essential things, which are not breathing and food and procreation and safety, music is one of the most omnipresent phenomena in the world. Normally I just ramble on, and this time I've actually divided my thing in parts too. So if it was a bit further on the thing, I would say get up and do some star jumps to keep fresh with this. But it's probably a little bit too early in the evening. We've seen in part one that virtually all music is made by people for other people. And I'm actually really looking forward to what Bridie is going to say on the topic of music and communities next week. The processes that lead to all aspects of creativity are generally inspired by an environment of historical, geographical, professional, family, social, or online connectedness. We have come to see musical creativity as a highly individual pursuit. So we have this idea of the composer in his attic room, probably on the verge of dying from TB, penning his great masterworks. In fact, everybody that makes music is connected in some way to an audience, to a past, whether they embrace that past and try to be the same as the people before, or whether they try to be drastically different than the people before. There's always a continuity in where we place ourselves. So I'm not sure that the early punk musicians are directly indebted to Johann Sebastian Bach's art of the fugue, but there is a clear reaction of punk musicians as saying, we don't like what these people did, we're going to do it like this. And they did use instruments that had been around for a little while. So I would say it's very useful to examine music in relation to community a little further in the quest to understand how music works in the 21st century. Bridie asked me to contribute to a handbook on community music, and I just have the proofs in my inbox. And while I was at Tashkent airport on my way to do from Kazakhstan to Japan, in transit from Kazakhstan to Japan, to deliver a lecture on community, I had 4 hours at an airport with no internet, no electricity, and no entertainment whatsoever. And I had no money that I could buy anything with. It was one of the most productive 4-hour stints I've ever had in preparing a lecture, because there was no distraction whatsoever. And I had about 30 minutes of power in my computer left. In community, people like Bardi and myself have been working in community, have been talking a lot about how do you define community music. It becomes very difficult because some of the community music definitions are so narrow that you can't, it's the same as with music, that are so narrow that they don't catch everything. So community music is a reaction against institutionalized music making. Sounds great, but it actually doesn't cover what really happens. And saying community music is people getting together and engaging with music also goes for opera first nights and symphony orchestra. So it's a bit difficult to see that as community music events. So rather than thinking about what community music is, in a project that Brady and I were involved in, Sound Links, we try to define some domains in which community music operates. Going a step further, I try to create a framework in which we can place what we now call community music. Normally we talk about community music as interventions in environments where there's too little music going on. Of course, the most logical form of community music is the music practice that developed and sustained within a community where it originated. And still, to this day, this is by far the most common context for community music. So there's music in villages, so how Javanese gamelan developed, how brass bands develop in many places, how garage bands develop, choirs. There's many, many examples of, if you like, organic community music where nobody tries to interfere and says, hey guys, we need to make music, but the community feels a need to make music. Then the next level is the interventionist community music, which is usually what we, since the 1970s, have been calling community music, where based on a perceived need, one or more music practices are developed by, for, or with the community to restore existing practices or introduce new ones. So this is the usual definition this is the usual description of what community music is. Finally, and I'm going to not make many friends with this, I've argued that institutionalized music making, like what's happening at the Conservatoire or what's happening in music schools, is in a way an embodiment of community thought as well. So there's a perceived need of a community or another stakeholder, it might be a nation or a city, which is translated into an organizational structure, mostly with the aim to provide a long-term solution to address the need of a community. Historically, we see this as the enemy of community music. Let me go into these a little bit more. First, organic community music. As a community forms or as it changes, it seeks to share or celebrate connections and events which may be around joy, like weddings, sadness, sickness or death, spirituality, the connection to gods or ancestors, significant recurring annual events like the return of light or of harvest, to name but a few, and that goes back to what I was talking about earlier as well. Within the community, and without external intervention, this can stay loosely and informally organized, as it often is, but it can also be highly structured. For instance, Balinese gamelan practice is very, very highly structured. Brass bands in Europe were pretty highly structured. South African Zulu choirs are very highly, like Lady Swift Black Mombazo fame, they're very, very highly organized. So it's not true that all community is just people happening to come together and doing something. Very often it's very highly structured. Sometimes it also isn't. I remember working in Serpa in Portugal, in Alentejo region in the south, where I was sitting in a bar and one man started singing a line and then all the other men started singing in parallel seconds. For those of you in music, that is a pretty jarring polyphony and pretty difficult to do. And then I found out that there's a style called canta anetejanu, which is linked to what the Bulgarian voices are doing and people in Sicily, which people just pick up. They sit in bars, they drink coffee, somebody starts singing, people learn how to sing in these parallel seconds. So there is that kind of spontaneous work, but there's also a lot of fairly organized, informal, organic community music. When we look at community music as an intervention, this is usually caused by the fact that a community loses practices of music making due to internal or external forces. There are many factors that may cause this, including gradual socio-economic change. So a lot of the early community music in the UK was in very disadvantaged areas where community music facilitators were called in to create greater social cohesion between people where that was lost, and joy for that matter. Then there's the impact of technological developments, which of course have changed the face of music very, very drastically in the last 50 years. So there's probably no period in the history of music which has seen more changes in how music developed in the last 50 years. We have simply changing tastes, so people like particular music and then they stop liking it. It's not interesting to them anymore. Sydney and Herman and I come from Dutch-speaking areas. There used to be Dutch folk music, which actually was largely derivative from German folk music, as I learned. So our Sinterklaas songs are actually German harvest songs, which is really quite embarrassing. But when I was growing up, there was a program called Onder de Groene Linde, which is under a particular type of tree, of which I don't know the English translation. And there were sort of ladies in the 70s and 80s who could still sing those songs. And 10 years later, it was gone. And there was no new generation that took it on. Is that a terrible thing? Maybe it is, but maybe it isn't. So we have to accept that some musics come into existence, have their day, and disappear. And sometimes that goes very fast, like in some pop music cycles. Sometimes it goes much slower than expected. I would have lost a lot of money in betting on rap music. When rap music came up, I thought, I can see the appeal of that. That will last for 5 years, and then it will be gone. I was very, very wrong. My investment would have been really, really badly positioned there. So sometimes we do not know what's going to work and what's not going to work, because rap music had a lot against it. Coming from a very disadvantaged social background, the translation to come from a disadvantaged social background and to turn that into something highly desirable, to the point that people in India, who actually are more racist than most people in the West, adapt a lower class or a working class black music and start singing raps about arranged marriages, like Apache Indian in London did, is really, really quite striking. So sometimes it's really difficult to predict what kind of forces work on every music. I'll come back to that in a second. There's technological development, changing tastes, but also conflict, displacement, disease, and a natural disaster throw a community, and very often their traditional musical practices disappear. Our colleague Richard Moyle from New Zealand has been writing about the Taku Atoll, which is slowly being submerged by global warming. Has nothing to do with music, but the people there will be dispersed, and what will happen to their music? Will it actually multiply in 7 different places, and will it stay unified through internet, or will it become 7 different traditions? All those principles have happened over the past many, many centuries. In many of those cases where music tends to disappear, often external agents or agencies come in to work with the community to restore existing practices, or more frequently, develop new practices that fit the need of the community at that particular time and in those particular circumstances. Community musicians often pride themselves on reversing the process of engaging with music from the didactic music teacher who comes in and says, I will share the mystery of Mozart with you, and you'll just do exactly and this is how the music is. A community musician theoretically sits with a group of people and says, hey guys, what are your musical ideas? Let's make what can we do? Interestingly, when the community musician has a choir background, they always want to do a choir. If they have a rock band background, they'll always become a rock band, or it will become a samba band. So the fact that community musicians say, we come in with a completely blank slate, none of us do. We've learned this as researchers over the past 50 years or so, and as musicians we also have to realize that whatever we do as musicians, we carry with us what we have learned to that moment. That does not mean that it's not a valid way of trying to reverse the process and empowering the people that you're working with. Institutionalized music making, or community music, works like this, according to what I think and have learned. When there's a long-term need for support for a particular music practice for a particular community, for instance, learning to perform Western classical music by middle-class children. I worked for 7 years at the Amsterdam Music School, which had 5,000 children learning first only classical music, and then slowly, because we're very slow to take these things up, and slowly jazz and pop, and then world music when I was asked to set up the World Music School there. Often the community will take action to find a long-term solution, seeking support from the community itself or from public authorities. This tends to be very successful when the people asking for it come from the same social background. So why do we have very good facilities for learning Western classical music everywhere? Because the people that are in power value Western classical music. So it's very easy to get money to say, don't you think that everybody should have access to fine music? So shouldn't we elevate working classes to this level so that they can engage with great music? Interestingly, when we did a, what we call a profit survey at the Amsterdam Music School, 80% of the students that we had came from the same upper middle class cultural intellectual elite as they did in the 1930s when we started that. So changing things, and we're finding this with universities as well, changing these things is not just changing your aims and saying we're making it available to everybody. It has to do with changing pedagogies. It has to do with changing values and attitude. It has to do with understanding how other people learn and how they think. There are other times when authorities superimpose organizational structures as interventionist institutionalization. I remember being involved in a fight against that when brass bands, which were kind of the world music of the Netherlands, so every village had its own brass band, and when Uncle so-and-so died and young Mary came, then she got the clarinet because that was the instrument that was available, and there was somebody else who could play the clarinet a little bit, and they taught it, and actually that worked quite well. And actually the one world music event that we have, the World Music Concours in Kerkrade, is a brass band competition, which is now consistently won by Thai brass bands, who are much better than the Dutch brass bands. Which is an interesting post-colonial phenomenon in itself. But the fact that that actually worked for for centuries, that has worked really, really well. And now, when I was working for the National Institute for Arts Education, we had the inspector of amateur arts and arts education saying, we want to formalize that. So we only want people with the proper papers to be able to lead those brass bands. And I fought that hand and tooth, foot, hand and something, and any other limb that you would like. Because I thought it was a really bad idea to destroy something that was working quite well as a community thing, building in an institutionalized society which needs to be subsidized, and by the time the subsidy falls, then the entire music starts falling flat instead of it continuing as it is. And this is a mistake I think we make very often. In community music circles, institutions are often seen as the enemy, but as I hope I explained very briefly, that is usually not their history, and their genesis is often community driven. I will come back to what happens with these institutions over time. A little interlude again. The repertoire, just an interesting side thought. The repertoire that is being used in these three different settings tend to have very different use of approach, tend to end up very differently. In organic community music, the repertoire typically emerges from the community and can become an important part of its sense of identity and heritage over time. And of course, we know many of these examples where a community creates a music and sees that as part of its national pride or its community pride. In interventionist community music, the music may be created on the spot, but often approaches and or sound structures from outside the community are used as a vehicle. And I try to explain that with the samba example. So very often it's another music that comes in to regenerate musical activity in the environment. In institutional settings, often the organic repertoire from the community turns static and into a canon with profound consequences. And I'll come back to those profound consequences. So when you institutionalize something, there's a great risk that it becomes static. And it's really almost impossible to avoid that. When music comes to a conservatoire, it's much easier to see something as a canon or as artifacts that you need to maintain rather than as a living tradition, which has made it difficult for traditions like jazz to survive well. So a lot of American college jazz is very, very static, technically very high level and very boring jazz because the very creativity that underlies it seems to have disappeared. The only example The most striking good example I've seen was in Finland at Sibelius Academy, where I walked into a classroom where there were two girls in the Finnish folk music program, and I asked them, what are you doing? And said, oh, we're making a wedding song in the style of this and this 1930s tradition. So part of the curriculum is not know 100 songs from this style, but make it. So this music was creative at the time, so keep creating that music. Most of you will be bored with me talking about sustainability by now. Yet I'll do it. As you all know, from the beginning of this century, there's been a growing awareness of challenges to the sustainability of music practices, particularly in the context of UNESCO's concerns for intangible cultural heritage, which actually was a fantastic idea. It sounds slightly pretentious to talk about intangible cultural heritage, but it gave a name to things which were not a pyramid, which were not the Taj Mahal, but things that were less a tradition of basket weaving, a storytelling tradition, a musical tradition. And we all knew that they existed, but by calling it intangible cultural heritage and building a policy framework around it, UNESCO did a great service, I think, to the world to make it a topic of discussion and a topic of concern. There's a whole suite of declarations and conventions from UNESCO, and in the book that Kathy and I are editing at the moment, that will come out in October, there'll be extensive discussion of that. Here, I think it's interesting to consider how each of the three categories of community music practice, aforementioned, organic, interventionist, and institutionalized, map on current thinking on sustainability and consider the possible implications of such an approach for the work that we do here. In terms of sustaining organic practices of music making, it's important to know that many organic practices of music making in communities are self-sustaining in principle, as evidenced by many age-old traditions. So many traditions do not need our concern or our work. They actually work. But it would be naive to see those traditions as static. Their strength, often over centuries, seems to lie in their ability to continually adapt to changes in tastes and circumstances. The music that I play and perform, which is an art tradition from India, North Indian classical music, it says it always stays the same, but we actually now have recordings from over 100 years ago, and actually it was played really quite differently. So the rhetoric remains, this music has always been the same, it's been the same for 4,000 years, but the actual changes in circumstances, because it moved context from places of worship, both Hindu and Muslim places of worship, to the Mughal courts, which were Muslim, to a middle-class society, which was largely Hindu at the beginning of the last century, through houses of courtesans in the 19th century, which we don't talk about because they were courtesans, and now into to a global audience. And the music has changed accordingly. It has, the performance formats have changed, the emphasis in how the improvisations work have changed, the emphasis on virtuosity has changed, as it should do with any tradition that goes through different changes. An interesting mechanism in these traditions is that people of the older generation usually say that the music is going down and down and down and down. So I've got quotes from the 1870s saying that Indian music is just getting worse and worse and worse. And every next generation will say, oh, the young people, they don't know how to play this music, because they use what they learned when they were young as the norm. And of course, the next generation, who will do things slightly differently, will not answer to those norms. I'm a terrible example of that. With all my open-minded thinking about music, I learned from gurus who left India in the 1970s, 60s and 70s, and so they took that aesthetic with them, and because they were away from India, they didn't change their aesthetic, so they taught me in that style. So when I go to India now and hear people in their 50s like myself play, I think they're terrible and stupid and newfangled. It's, oh my God, they have no taste at all, they have no depth, it's all virtuosity, it doesn't make any sense. And I realize I'm one of these old farts that reacts against the change in a tradition. But if that was happening in the 1870s already, and then 100 years later we had people like Ravi Shankar and Ali Akbar and Vilayat Khan, the great musicians of that generation. Then probably the idea that everything gets worse and worse is not entirely true. Many efforts to preserve or safeguard such practices run the risk of institutionalizing and museumizing them, rendering them irrelevant in the medium to long term. So what I do see happening in institutions, particularly in Asia at the moment, is that they freeze a tradition in a particular time. Like take a photo of a tradition. In Turkey, this happened as well under Ataturk, with the music of the Ashik. They, instead of a living tradition of wandering bards, it became a repertoire of 5,000 songs that we have recorded by these bards. And the problem is that while this may be very, very valuable music, if you don't change it from generation to generation, they run the risk of becoming less and less relevant to people. Then music interventions in community and sustainability. Much of what community music facilitators do in response to a direct and often urgent need is in response to a direct and often urgent need. Some of activities have a long-term purpose, bringing together people who've lost connection due to economic hardships in life or discrimination and other hostilities due to their history, ethnicity, or race. I've referred to this before. And others have shorter-term objectives, like healing after natural disaster or in conflict-affected settings. My doctoral student, Gillian Howell, should be completing her thesis in the next year or two, and that should be of great interest for those interested in that. Those will typically be quite intense interventions and have less of an express need for sustainability, at least in their initial form. So they're actually there to heal something at a particular time. When we talk of sustainability of music in institutional settings, at first glance, of course, they seem to be the most robust basis for sustainability for most music practices, with infrastructure, professionals, guidelines in place, and usually a steady stream of funds assured. And Paul and Scott know very well how robust that stream of funds is all the time. However, after a few decades, and sometimes just years, and sometimes generations, something happens. We may see institutions change priorities from serving the community to their own survival, with the possibility of acting against their original brief. An institution is always started with the best of intentions. So it starts, a university is started to develop and disseminate knowledge. What a beautiful, noble thing. But by a few generations down the road, it becomes more important for the institution to save itself than to serve the need that it does. So we can get a increased disjunct between what an institution is for originally and what it actually does, to the point that sometimes it starts eating its own principles. There's a whole series of horrible sci-fi movies like RoboCop, where a computer is programmed to save the community, and then somewhere about 20 minutes out from the end, something goes terribly wrong, and it starts preying on the people that it's supposed to protect. I think we working in institutions have to be constantly aware that this is a very, very real risk. And I've seen, working with the International Society for Music Education, how difficult it is to change that. I was asked to be in a committee on the future of world conferences, and the committee came to the conclusion that the future of world conferences for ISME should be no world conferences for ISME, because our purpose was to serve the community of music educators best. The only thing we got was very affluent people that wanted to fly to nice holiday destinations and come together for a conference. So we said, why don't you split it up into more regional and more themed conferences? But ISME, the reaction of the ISME board at the time was, we will thank you for your services, we don't need your committee any longer. So we have to really watch, these are very, very difficult principles, and all of us, when we have started something interesting, it's really difficult to say goodbye to them. So there's a kind of, we've put energy into something, we try to build something beautiful, and to say, great, this has had its time, now it's over. There's one initiative I've been involved with called Cultural Diversity in Music Education, a series of conferences which is now getting to its 12th or 13th in Nepal next year. And we've decided to not have any structure at all. So if we find that it's not important for us to meet anymore, we don't have to fire a secretary, we don't have to close down a bank account, there's actually no organizational structure at all. Every 2 years somebody puts up their hand and say, I'll organize the next one. And a group of people says, what a great idea, let us help you refine the call for papers, and then the next one happens. That's actually a beautiful structure where we rarely see these kind of structures in the kind of work that we do. If that happens, that first affects the perceived value and usefulness to the communities. The communities start saying, why are they there? We're not really benefiting from this. And next to their very lifeline, the funding bodies, because the funding bodies are in turn triggered by the communities. And this, I see Paul nod, so this goes for universities, but it also goes for conservatoires, and for many, many of the organizations we work in. These are nasty, dangerous things to have to realize. If we compare the three settings, we probably have to rank the sustainability of the three contexts of music in this way. Organic music making in community, as long as change is not too drastic in terms of depth and gradual in time, is probably the strongest in terms of sustainability. Institutionalized music making, although its longevity may be overestimated due to the auto-destruct mechanism I just described, is probably the next one. And community music interventions, as they often have short-term agendas and almost never have a solid funding basis, are probably the shortest, although some of those can be considered to become organic if they manage to translate into something that the community continues wanting. Part 3, and the final part. Music diversity and sustainability in a global context. This is the work I've been working on a lot of that with Kathy over the past, but also with international colleagues over the last almost 10 years actually. 10 years ago we started planning for this, which I think is very, very important. The link between sustainability and what we do in music is on the international agenda, but it's also dealt with quite naively, I think. I referred to it before, and it's now more pronounced than ever before. While globalization and rapid technological developments have in fact given more people access to more music than ever before, and this is an important thing to realize. So there's a lot of doom thinking and doom saying about, oh my God, it's going so badly with music. There's never been a time in the history of mankind when more people have had access to more music. What the internet has done for music, not only for us in privileged environments, but for people in small communities, in Indonesia, in Zimbabwe, in Chile, it's amazing what people can reach now. Johann Sebastian Bach had to walk for 3 days through the rain to hear Buxtehude play in Lübeck. Actually, I sat in the church where he did that, which was an amazing experience. And somebody started playing organ. I ran half an hour late for my meeting. I just think to hear what Bach must have heard, something akin to what Bach must have heard 300 years ago, was something that I was not going to miss for a very important meeting on the future of conservatoires. But if you wanted to play Indian classical music 100 years ago, you would be lucky to hear 3 great masters play a particular raga, so you could learn how people played that raga. When I was learning ragas, I could buy 20 records with the greatest people playing Rag Yaman and seeing exactly how they each approached it. So the way we learn music, the way we can enjoy music, the way we can have a party, and without having a great band there, we can actually have the music of Prince or Astor Piazzolla, whoever we want playing there. It's just absolutely amazing. Sometimes we don't realize how different that is, and if I look at my lovely daughter here in the hall, how she has, was it 5,000 songs or something? You've got a new iPod? A lot. The access people have to music now, and the way they engage with music has changed so much, and is so much richer than it used to be. But at the same time, many music practices struggle to deal with rapid change. The risk of diversity declining, disappearing, or even entire traditions being disappeared, in the words of our mentor, Tony Seeger, is very, very real. Being disappeared means it doesn't disappear by natural means, but there's active disappearing happening. For instance, the music of the Sami in Lapland, the northern part of Finland and Norway, has been largely destroyed by Christian missionaries. They just destroyed their drums because they said this is unholy music, you can't make this music anymore. There's a lot of that happening, not only by commercial forces, also by ideologies. Governments, NGOs, and now especially UNESCO, I've mentioned them before, have flagged threats to intangible cultural heritage as one of the great challenges of this century, creating global awareness and targeted action. But it's this targeted action that I want to spend the last 5 or 10 minutes on. What we've seen very often are very logical reactions to music disappearing. So I would say there's 5 key responses to music in need of safeguarding, as UNESCO calls it. The very wording, music in need of safeguarding, suggests building a wall around a particular music. So rather than saying, let's make a fertile ground so that the music can continue to exist, it's warfare wordings that are being used. So what do people do? And they're all completely sensible things to do. They make archives of recorded and notated music. They organize festivals and events, raising awareness. They give subsidies for specific music practices, which includes Western mainstream music, where 85% of the national funding for music is towards high-end art music in Australia and in most other places. They gave awards and recognition for senior culture bearers, including the lovely habit in Asia of making people living national treasures. So a musician that has shown that they have been great musicians for a long time, they're named living national treasures and giving a stipend by the government because they embody this great tradition. And many of those are oral traditions, so it's like bestowing money to a library. You actually bestow money to a person because they embody this great tradition. And in return, they're expected to teach people and to continue being active in the community of that particular art. And of course, there's workshops and education for next generation of practitioners. They're all very logical things, but to what extent do they take into consideration the actual processes that drive sustainability? I will very quickly take you through the idea of ecology and ecosystems. As I had time to read a book, thank you very much for acknowledging that I now have read a book, Bridie. As I had time to read a book, I actually thought, why don't I go back into the history of ecological thinking, because that started raising its head in talking about sustainability in music. It came from Haeckel, Ernst Haeckel in 1870, who talks about the study of all those complex interrelations referred to by Darwin as the conditions of the struggle for existence. This is thinking that's not unfamiliar to any of us. That has proven to be a very powerful tool to address processes in biology, but over time has gained considerable traction as an attractive metaphor in other disciplines as far afield as urban planning, energy preservation, and organizational structures. It's become very, very fashionable to use ecology and sustainability in almost everything. So if you're in McDonald's, you'll probably see sustainability in their rhetoric as well now. Everybody does something sustainable. Interesting, it took 65 years for someone to talk about ecosystems, and this was A.C. Tansley, who described the concept of ecosystems as the whole system in the sense of physics, which is interesting because he went to another discipline, including not only the organism complex, but also the whole complex of physical factors forming what we call the environment of the biome, the habitat factors in the widest sense. Though the organism may claim our primary interest, when we are trying to think fundamentally, we cannot separate them from their special environment with which they form one physical system. That's a very interesting definition in terms of thinking about music. So if you replace the word biome for music, you actually get something which is quite sensible. I will skip these because that's... So what Tansley and the first people writing about music point to is that sustainability can be seen as dependent on a complex of forces that impact on their sustainability, much like an ecosystem works on an organism, largely irrespective of musical structure or content. And that constitutes a major departure from two dominant Western narratives. First of all, that the most worthy and valuable musics survive. There's two problems with that. One is who decides what is the most valuable music, so that there is no absolute judgment of that. Until the middle of the last century, we were pretty certain that it was Western classical music, particularly the 19th century music that was that, and very cleverly people measured all other musics of the world against 19th century Western music, and obviously all other music failed miserably at being 19th century Western music. I've done the same thing coming from raga music, explaining how terrible Wagner is at doing appropriate raga music. He has no sense of tala, he has no sense of bhav, so all the essential elements of raga are missed very, very miserably by Wagner, in spite of his greatness, in his own way. So that's one problem, and the other problem is that it's not true. So unless we all think here, those of us that like Western classical music, that André Rieu is the greatest performer of Western classical music, we actually are wrong. So André Rieu sells more Western classical music than anybody else. He sells more than the Concertgebouw Orchestra, he sells more than the Berlin Philharmoniker, so obviously he must be the best Western music. There's actually other factors playing a very, very major role in that. Yet many of us still believe in this. And the other problem that we have is that it makes sense to try to preserve music genres as artifacts rather than as practices. Nicholas Cook in '98, in his wonderful Music, A Very Short Introduction, described the idea of the musical museum, that we've actually museumized our music rather than kept it as a continuing creative practice. So we say that these people and our children learn. I've noticed this in working in music education, around age 10, that music is not made by them but by other people. So that's when they start listening to popular music a lot. And then, so before that, they make their own songs, whether they're good songs or bad songs, it doesn't matter. And only afterwards, people say, okay, music is made by other people and we can replicate it, but the idea that you're part of the creative process continually is much less strongly pronounced, particularly in Western cultures, than it was in many other cultures. Javier is an exception of that because we still make very bad songs together. So, getting to Tansley's definition, we can tentatively define any music culture as an ecosystem in the following way. The whole system, not only a specific music genre, but the entire complex of factors defining the genesis, development, and sustainability of the surrounding music culture in the wider sense, including the role of individuals, communities, values and attitudes, learning processes, context for making music, infrastructure and organization, rights and regulations, diaspora and travel, media and the music industry. So the idea that came very strongly from the project we did, the Musical Futures project, is that if you describe those factors for any music practice, you get a much more realistic picture of whether they're viable and how they're viable. This works across 5 different domains, which I won't go into at the moment. Every music is being learned and taught. Every music relates to communities, as I discussed extensively before. The context in which music is made is important, as are the constructs, the values and attitudes underlying it. Infrastructure and regulations are sort of the hardware. Infrastructure is the hardware of music. Concert halls, regulations is IP regulations, but also grants and subsidies, but also noise restriction. And then there's media and the music industry. So how every music interrelates with the media and the music industry is important for how sustainable it is. I'm not going to go into each of those in great detail at the moment, but what I'll show you is the total picture that emerges from that, which shows a music practice being influenced by these 5 different domains. So the top one is the community one that I talked about a lot. The yellowish one next to it is the teaching, the factors in teaching. Then infrastructure and regulation, the very nice flower pattern there. Then the crushed flower of media and the music industry. And finally, the context and constructs. So what we found is that if you describe any music practice that you know from these perspectives, you probably get a fairly accurate picture of how viable or how sustainable or not sustainable it is. And if there's problems, you will very often say, this is a problem and that's a problem. these are not single forces. All of them are interrelated. So if a music has high prestige, there's a good chance that there are patrons in the community. There's a good chance that many people want to learn it. There's a good chance that there'll be money for music schools and conservatoires. And there's a good chance that there'll be extensive media exposure. So all of them interrelate with each other. But it's proven to be quite a fruitful way of describing a musical ecosystem, and this very emphatically describes music as something which is dynamic rather than something static. What have we learned from all of this? While music is firmly rooted in individual needs and wants in communities and the global cultural traditions, music practices can only be understood as in constant flux. And this includes music that we see as very static. So very many people look at the Western canon as static, but as people like Roy will argue, that's probably not the right way of looking at it. And creativity was at the center of that music when it was being made, and the spirit of creativity should probably continue to be at the center of that music as it's being handed down and reproduced or brought to life again. There's very little danger, and this is really good news, there's very little danger of music ever dying out altogether as a major human pursuit. If we kill all institutions, if we tell people they can't make music anymore, music will re-arise. There's actually no way we can kill music. However, there are constant challenges for musical diversity and sustainability on a global scale, particularly for small musics. I don't think globalization is the enemy. I think globalization is just one of the forces that works on music, but it's had a strong influence on small local traditions that were being overrun by other musics, very often associated with power issues, with economic issues, and it's those musics that we need to look at very carefully with the communities themselves. There used to be a trend amongst ethnomusicologists to save musics, whether the communities like them or not. I don't think that's particularly worthwhile. If a community says, we're done with this music, then that music might be done. We can still archive it for future reference, but and a next generation might want to re-engage with it. But if a community says, we would love to keep this music alive in this and this particular way, I think it's important that we start looking at that pattern, the ecosystem picture, and see if we can devise strategies to make things work for them. Some words of invocation. All of us working in music, I think, are well advised to understand, embrace, and work with the forces that impact on all music practices, and also respect that they're all there, so we can serve our muse to the best of our abilities. With intelligence, I always advocate a fierce intelligence and critical mind for this, without any fear of finding things that are uncomfortable for us. And with the humor and compassion worthy of the deep humanity that music brings us. And I think, Greg, I'm very grateful that you're here amongst us today, because I think Greg very much embodied this spirit at the con when I first arrived in 2003. There's so much work to be done by all of us. We're incredibly blessed that we work with music, but we also need to make the hard decisions and have the hard discussions with each other. I think the risk that we have at the moment is we just think everything's going kind of all right and just things will continue. We've already seen with many small traditions, but also with orchestras in Berlin, that you can't just sit back and say, we're doing fine. We constantly have to be aware. We constantly have to have the discussions on what is the best way of doing things. We, as scholars and academics, need to keep talking to industry, which will be my next station, and work out ways in which we can make the incredible diversity and incredible richness that we have of music work as well as possible for the 21st century. Thank you very much. Thank you.